They came from the east, a tide of hooves and smoke that swallowed kingdoms whole. Cities once proud and prosperous vanished in a single winter. Merchants spoke their names with trembling lips. Kings bolted their gates in the dead of night. Mothers hushed their children not with stories of monsters, but with the truth of men on horseback who carried a horizon with them. And yet, there was one place, a fragile kingdom perched on the edges of mountains and trade routes, where history paused just long enough to ask, would they resist or would they kneel? The year was 1243, and the winds that swept through Anatolia carried more than the scent of pine and snow. They carried rumor, fear, and the distant echo of war drums. In the halls of Shivas, where the Seljuk Sultan Kaykhusraw II held court, the tapestries still glimmered with silk from China, the tables still groaned beneath silver and pomegranates. But the air was heavy, uncertain. Traders from the east no longer lingered. Their caravans arrived leaner, quieter, their eyes darting to horizon as if shadows were chasing them. 2 seasons ago, one merchant whispered to the Sultan's viziers, the cities of Persia burned, Nishaper gone, Ray silent. The Mongols ride west, and the earth bends beneath them. The viziers dismissed him at first. They had heard such tales before, Mongol hordes, unstoppable, unmerciful, yet always distant, always other people's tragedy. But then came the second messenger, his cloak torn by frost, his beard rimed with ice. He spoke of towns abandoned, of bridges cut, of scouts who moved like spirits between the valleys. His words were not loud, but they carried the weight of a funeral bell. The Sultan, a man as proud as he was uncertain, stood in the great hall beneath the carved eagles of rum and clenched his jeweled fingers around the arms of his throne. He was no fool. He knew the Mongols were not mere raiders. They were an empire that had unseated empires, that turned sultans into exiles and caliphs into guests in their own palaces. But he was also no coward, or at least he believed he could not afford to appear as one. Send for generals, he said. If the storm comes west, let it find a standing. But Anatolia was not a land at peace with itself. The nobles quarreled. The Armenian lords whispered their own designs. The Byzantines along the coast watched like hawks circling carrion. And in the villages, the common folk tilled the frozen soil and prayed not for victory, but for survival. It was a strange winter that year. The night stretched long, and the moon cast pale light over roads once busy with trade. Caravans now moved only in daylight, if at all. Shepherds in the highlands swore they saw campfires where no village lay, and herds vanished without a sound. And always, always, the wind carried the sound of hooves, even when no horse could be seen. The first act of the story is not a battle, but a waiting that stretched from hearth to fortress, from merchant stall to royal council. For weeks, letters were sent to distant allies. Few replied. The Crusader lords of the West had their own squabbles. The Abbasid caliph in Baghdad sent words, but no swords. And from the Mongols? Silence, the kind that meant they were already closer than you wished. "Do you hear them, my Sultan?" asked an old general one evening as the snow fell upon the palace roofs. The steppe does not send warnings. It sends shadows first, and shadows do not bargain. The Sultan turned from the window. His eyes were hard, his jaw set like the marble beneath his feet. If they want this land, he said, they will have to fight for it. And so the summons were sent. Farmers were pressed into service. Banners were unfurled from Konya to Erzurum. The forges burned through the night, spitting sparks that danced against the cold. Yet even as the army gathered, there were those who questioned. Was this courage or a march toward ruin? A kingdom at war does not march with its sword alone. It marches with its doubts, its whispers, and the ghosts that follow behind every banner. The call to arms had gone out. Across the rugged spine of Anatolia, messengers rode with wax-sealed orders. their horses foaming from cold breath and restless miles. Villages emptied of able-bodied men. Blacksmiths slept beside their forges, hammering iron until their arms ached. But war is never just steel and command. War is rumor, and rumor moved faster than any cavalry. By the time the Seljuk banners gathered at Shivas, the streets were crowded with soldiers, mercenaries, and hopeful pilgrims. Some came for glory, some for coin, others because they had no choice. The air smelled of wet leather and damp wool, of spiced wine spilled on frozen cobblestone, of men sharpening blades they prayed never to use. The city gates closed each night earlier than the last. Sultan Kaykhusraw II walked among his captains in the torchlit hall, the map of his fragile realm unfurled across the table. Thin black lines marked mountain passes. Small circles marked strongholds. But what he wanted most, certainty, was nowhere on that parchment. He pointed to the east with his gloved hand. "Here," he said, his voice carrying to the corners of the hall. "They cross into Persia. Here, they broke the Khwarezmian armies like dry twigs. But this is not the same. Anatolia is a harder bone to chew. We have mountains. We have allies." A murmur stirred among the council. Allies? Few had answered. The Georgians had sent only promises. The Crusader lords along the coast sent silence, and the Abbasid Caliphate sent prayers, wrapped in ink and nothing more. Still, the Sultan's words needed to sound like certainty, because the alternative was panic. One advisor, a tall man with a scar running from cheek to ear, leaned over the table. "My Sultan, the Mongols do not march as we do. They move in clouds. They strike at night, vanish by dawn. To fight them here on this field is to chase the wind." "So you would have us kneel before it?" The Sultan snapped, his jeweled ring catching the light. "Send them tribute, bow our heads, and hope they leave scraps on our table? No, this land was bought in blood, and it will be defended the same way." There were nods, forced perhaps, but nods nonetheless. Yet beneath their fur-lined collars, many of those men thought of their estates, their wives, their winter-stored grain. They thought of the roads that might soon run red from Shivas to Erzurum. The march began in the deep weeks of winter. It was not the triumphant thunder of an army confident in its cause. It was the slow, grinding push of men and beasts through snow-choked passes. Frost clung to the tassels of their standards. At night, the fires burned low and wide, because the commanders feared what watched from the hills. Strange things began to happen. Scouts sent to the front lines failed to return. A wagon train disappeared between two hills without a sound of struggle, only the faint smoke of its camp left behind. Tracks in the snow showed no retreat, only dispersal, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. "What hunts us?" one young soldier whispered to another as they marched. "Not what?" the older man muttered. "Who?" There were nights when the wind carried the sound of flutes, thin, eerie, distant. The Mongols were masters of fear as much as war. They knew how to let silence gnaw at an army until its edges frayed. And fray it did. Disputes broke out over rations. Mercenaries from distant lands demanded their payment up front. Armenian lords, who had sworn to stand beside the Sultan, sent fewer men than promised, claiming sickness in their lands. The seeds of discord sprouted in the frost. And yet they marched on. 2 weeks into the campaign, they reached the high plains near Köse Dağ, a range of low, jagged mountains, their slopes striped with snow like the backs of sleeping beasts. It was here the Sultan ordered camp. The decision, some whispered, was both brave and foolish. Brave, because it placed them between the Mongols and the heart of Anatolia. Foolish, because it placed them far from their supply lines, exposed in a land where the wind itself seemed to be an enemy. The campfires dotted the valley like restless stars. Men huddled in cloaks stiff with frost, their breath rising in plumes. The air smelled of horse sweat, damp wool, and the faint bitterness of fear. "Have you seen them?" a voice would whisper in the dark. "No, but they've seen us." There was one night when a figure rode in from the east, a lone horseman, ragged and pale. He carried no banner. His words were hoarse, as though carved from the cold. "They are close," he said, falling to his knees before the guards. "Closer than you think. They let me go so I could tell you." The council met again, this time in a tent whose canvas strained under the winter wind. The Sultan paced, the frost cracking under his boots. "We strike first," one general urged. "Show them we are not the prey." "Or we wait," said another, older and slower to speak. "Let them come. Let them reveal their numbers. We fight shadows now. The sun must rise before the sword is drawn." The debate dragged like a blunt blade. Outside, the soldiers drank bitter tea and mended torn leather. Inside, pride and fear wrestled in the firelight. And always, the horizon remained quiet, too quiet. In those days, something shifted among the ranks. Confidence turned to tension. Tension turned to unease. Some claimed to hear the Mongol hooves in the night. Others swore they saw smoke on the eastern hills. The Sultan ordered no retreat, no word of fear to pass between lips. But the air had changed. It was the kind of silence that comes before a great storm, or the collapse of a roof long rotted beneath its tiles. There was one man, his name seldom recorded, who stood watch on the eastern ridge the night before the first arrows flew. He later told, in a tavern years after the war, they had seen lights moving like fireflies on the mountainside, too many to count, too quick to chase. "I thought the stars had fallen," he said, "but stars don't scream when the wind rises." When dawn came to Köse Dağ, it did not rise in gold. It rose in gray, an ashen veil over the mountains, the kind of light that makes men wonder the sun had forgotten them. The Seljuk army stirred long before the first light touched the snow. Armor creaked. Horses stamped against the frozen ground, and breath hung thick as mist. Men whispered to one another, their voices brittle as reeds in winter. They had been waiting for days, each sunrise a promise of conflict that never came. But this morning, something was different. The air itself felt taut, like a bowstring drawn and waiting to snap. The first sound was not the trumpet of war, nor the shout of a scout. It was a low hum, distant, steady, hooves, many hooves. The sound came from the eastern ridges, and it grew like a heartbeat carried on the cold wind. "To arms!" the cry went up, echoing across the valley. Banners lifted. Spears bristled. The Seljuk host, 1,000 strong, formed ranks that glittered with frost. The Sultan himself rode to the front, his cloak of sable furs sweeping behind him, his breath fogging the cold air. His eyes, dark and restless, scanned the hills. Then they appeared. At first, they were no more than shadows, tiny figures against the dawn. Then came the glint of metal, the flare of banners, the ripple of movement, the Mongol vanguard, swift riders, their ponies sure-footed on the icy slopes, their bows already strung. They moved like a single creature, a tide of black and red, rising and falling with the land. "Hold the line," the generals barked. "Wait for the signal." But waiting is a heavy thing in the mouth of an army. Every heartbeat was a drum, every breath a question. And then, with a shrill cry like a falcon's scream, the first arrows fell. It was not a volley. It was a rain. Arrows darkened the sky, whistling down upon the Seljuk front lines with a hiss that drowned out prayer and curse alike. Men raised shields, horses reared. The snow turned to slush beneath sudden blood. The Mongols had not come to charge. They had come to unmake. The Seljuks answered with their own archers, but the range was poor. The wind carried their shafts wide. The Mongols rode in loose formation, never still, their ponies darting and wheeling like swallows over water. They loosed their arrows, vanished behind a ridge, and reappeared elsewhere, always at a distance, always just out of reach. "They mock us," one captain spat, wiping the frost from his beard. "They want us to break." And break some did. A company of light cavalry, too eager, too proud, surged forward without orders. They spurred their horses up the ridge, swords raised high. For a moment, the field watched them go, a brave nod of defiance against a moving shadow. The Mongols opened like a gate. A sudden path, clear and inviting. The Seljuk riders charged through, and the hills closed behind them. From both sides, the arrows came again. Screams cut the morning air. When the survivors crawled back down, their armor was torn, their banners shredded, their courage bled into the snow. The Sultan clenched his reins, his gloves slick with frost. "We will not be baited," he muttered to the vizier at his side. But the army heard. They always hear. Words meant for counsel have a way of sinking into the marrow of men when the wind is sharp and the arrows fall. The Mongols press a rhythm. They feigned retreat, then struck the flanks. They vanished, then reappeared in greater number. Drums thundered from the hills, low and distant, like the heartbeat of a giant waiting to wake. "Why do they not charge?" a soldier whispered, his shield arm trembling. "Because they do not need to," came the grim reply. By midday, the field was restless. Supplies wagons burned in the rear. Messengers galloped between divisions with faces pale as the snow. And in the midst of it all, the Sultan debated. Attack or hold? Advance or retreat? Every moment stretched like a blade drawn slow. Then came the order. We advance. The army moved. Trumpets blared, and the Seljuk host began its march up the ridge where the Mongol banners flickered. The ground was uneven, the snow thick, the formation already fraying. Men stumbled, lines wavered, and still no Mongol charge. Halfway up the slope, the drums changed. A single beat, then silence. Then the hills erupted. From the sides, from the rear, from the shadows of the rocks, the Mongol army poured like water breaking a dam. Horse archers in the hundreds, then thousands, their arrows falling not in a line, but in a storm. The Seljuks turned to fight, but the lines had twisted, the commands lost in the wind. Horses bolted. Standards fell. "Form the square," a voice cried. "Hold your ground." But ground was a luxury. The battlefield was no longer theirs. It belonged to the riders who circled, struck, withdrew, and struck again. It was then that the Sultan made his choice. History would later argue whether it was cowardice or cunning, instinct or treachery. But in that hour, with the snow turning to mud and the banners collapsing around him, Kaykhusraw II turned his horse and fled the field. Some saw it. Many felt it. An army senses when its heart has left the chest. Panic spread like fire through dry reeds. Officers shouted until their throats bled. Some fought to the last. Others dropped their weapons and ran. The Mongols pressed the advantage. No longer cautious, they descended upon the scattered ranks like wolves on lambs. The valley that morning had been white as bone. By sunset, it was a smear of gray, red, and smoke. No one truly remembers who gave the last order that day, wrote a chronicler many years later. Because orders no longer mattered. There was only the sound of hooves, the hiss of the arrow, and the long, cold silence that comes when a kingdom breaks. Night fell on Köse Dağ not with peace, but with a hollow quiet. Fires burned where tents once stood. Horses wandered without riders. The wind carried no drums now, only the stench of charred wood and steel. And somewhere in that dark, among the wreckage of ambition and pride, the Mongol commanders sat by their fires, their victory as efficient as it was inevitable. At dawn, the mountains held their breath. The air was cold enough to bite, and a thin veil of mist clung to the valleys below Köse Dağ. Frost glazed the grass like shards of glass, and the breath of every horse steamed white against the dim horizon. For weeks, rumors had coiled around the Seljuk camp. Rumors of numbers, of traps, of an enemy that never truly slept. But now, the waiting had ended. Scouts returned in the dead of night, their faces drawn, their voices thin. The Mongols were near. And so they came. At first, only shadows moved along the ridge, riders like black needles against the pale sky. So far they seemed no more than birds. But as the sun inched higher, the line thickened. What emerged from the folds of the earth was not an army in the way the Seljuks knew armies. It was a tide, fluid, patient, stretching beyond sight. They did not march in columns of pride or trumpet their presence with drums. They moved like a whisper turning into a roar. The Seljuk camp stirred uneasily. Banners snapped in the chill, their colors bright, but their promise uncertain. Kaykhusraw II rode among his men, his cloak heavy with fur, his eyes set with resolve that did not quite reach his knuckles, clutching the reins. He had chosen this ground, this slope beneath Köse Dağ, believing the heights would give him strength. But even the mountain felt smaller now. "Let them see our numbers," one of his generals muttered, scanning the ranks that lined the fields. Tens of thousands, banners from every corner of his fractured realm. Seljuk cavalry, Armenian lords with their mailed retainers, mercenaries from the west, levies clutching spears like prayers. No horde can swallow the earth when the earth stands ready. But the Mongols had swallowed more than earth before. The first arrows came before noon, silent messengers that fell not to kill, but to remind. A rider toppled, a horse screamed, then the steppe opened its throat, and the true music began. It was not a charge, not yet. The Mongols wheeled like hawks, their hooves pounding the frost into mud. Arrows hissed in waves, bending the air, thudding against shields and snapping the bones of the front line. The Seljuks advanced in turn. Shields locked, spears braced, cavalry surging to meet the flanks. For a moment, steel met silence. Then came the feigned retreat. It was a dance the Mongols had mastered, a serpent sway, a retreat that was not defeat but bait. Their vanguard broke like a wave, luring the Seljuk cavalry forward, deeper, hungrier, into the valley where the mist clung thicker. Trumpets blared, the mountain echoed, and the trap closed. From the ridges on both sides, riders poured, arrows blackening the sky, hooves tearing the frost from the ground. The Seljuk wings faltered, commands drowned in the chaos. One moment the banners flew proud, the next they were swallowed by smoke and screams. Horses stumbled on frozen earth. Men vanished into the crush, their cries cut short by curved steel. Kaykhusraw II watched from the rear, his fingers numb despite the fur. "Hold them! Regroup!" he shouted, but the wind stole his words. What he saw was not a line breaking. It was a tide receding, a slow unraveling of resolve. The mercenaries fled first, then the levies. Only the proudest of his lords held their ground. And for every one who stood, two were cut down by arrows they could not see. The Mongols did not roar their victory. They tightened it. Every retreat was a snare, every advance a beckoning hand. When the Seljuk cavalry tried to flank, they found empty space. When they turned to retreat, they found fire at their heels. By dusk, the valley was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard of banners. The Sultan's tent still stood, but his army did not. Night crept in, carrying the groans of the wounded and the cold indifference of stars. Köse Dağ had spoken, and it had spoken in the language of ash. In the cold dawn after the battle, the mountain was silent, but silence is never empty. The battlefield at Köse Dağ was a canvas of frost and ruin. Spears jutted like brittle stalks of winter wheat. Broken shields lay face down in the mud, their emblems obscured, their promises unkept. Smoke coiled lazily from the wreckage where tents once stood proud. And beneath the rising sun, the fallen stretched farther than the eye wished to follow. Sultan Kaykhusraw II sat in the saddle of a borrowed horse, his own lost in the chaos of retreat. His cloak was torn, his crown forgotten in the haste of flight. The night before his army had been a thing of pride. Tens of thousands under his banner, banners that flapped like a storm at his command. Now, what remained were scattered bands, frightened and leaderless, trickling westward like a river broken into rivulets. He did not speak as his viziers rode beside him. Their words had dried up in the long hours of flight. Only the sound of hooves on frozen earth remained, and the occasional cry of a wounded man left behind. Behind them, the Mongols did not pursue in a mad rush. They advanced as they always had, measured, patient, deliberate. There was no need for them to chase the wind, for the wind now carried their scent, and the land itself seemed to fold before them. "What now, my sultan?" whispered a voice at his side. The vizier's beard was gray with frost, his eyes hollow. Kaykhusraw did not answer at once. His gaze swept the western horizon, where the cities of Anatolia still slept in uneasy peace. Shiva's Kayseri, Konya. His throne still stood, his palace still gleamed. But what was a palace when the gates of the realm lay open? "We return," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "We will rebuild. We will gather again." But even as he spoke, the truth gnawed at the edges of his words. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had been more than soldiers. It had been a web of alliances, Armenian princes, Greek merchants, nomadic tribes, the fickle loyalties of crusader lords. And each thread had been stretched thin. The battle had not merely shattered an army. It had shaken the spine of a kingdom. The Mongol advance. In the days that followed, the Mongols did not waste their victory in idle slaughter. They swept through the valleys like winter itself, cold, efficient, unstoppable. Cities that resisted burned. Cities that opened their gates were spare for now, but forced to bow and pay tribute. Their method was a lesson as much as a conquest. Submission spared your children. Defiance fed the steppe. Envoys came to the Seljuk court, their words as calm as their arrows had been swift. "The great Khan does not wish to destroy your land," they said, "only to rule it as the wind rules the grass. Pay, kneel, and live." Kaykhusraw II, broken in pride but alive in body, did what so many others had done before him. He signed the tribute. Gold would flow east. His armies would be leashed. His title would remain, but only as long as it served the Khan's ledger. Thus the Sultanate survived, not as a power, but as a vassal. The mountain that had once promised safety had become a monument to surrender, the echo of defeat. News of Köse Dağ traveled faster than caravans. From Constantinople to Cairo, from the courts of Europe to the mosques of Persia, the story spread. The Mongols were no longer a distant storm. They were the horizon itself. Kings measured their borders and wondered how long their walls would stand. Merchants whispered new routes, avoiding ashes where markets once thrived. And among the common folk, a different kind of silence settled. The silence of resignation. Taxes grew heavier. Soldiers passed their doors not as protectors, but as reminders of a debt they had not chosen. The songs of the steppe began to echo in their markets. Strange words, foreign coin, new masters. Legacy of Köse Dağ. Years later, when chroniclers wrote the battle, they did not mark it as the bloodiest nor the grandest, but they marked it as a turning, an opening of the gate that had once held firm. Anatolia would never again be a shield. It became a crossroads of tribute, a passageway for greater storms to come. The fall of Baghdad, the shifting tides of crusades, the long shadow that would one day give rise to the Ottomans themselves. And in the villages of the mountain's foot, elders told their children a simpler version. There was a day we stood, and the earth swallowed us. Remember it, for the earth remembers. The Sultan's last ride. Kaykhusraw II lived on, though the victory feast he once dreamed of never came. He returned to Konya a quieter man, his halls colder despite the fires. In public, he spoke of rebuilding. In private, he stared long at the mountains to the east, as if still seeing the banners swallowed by snow. Some said he was haunted, not by the Mongols, but by the moment he chose to stand rather than kneel, the moment courage and hubris became indistinguishable. Others said he was already planning a way back, a future revenge that history would never grant him. He died a vassal, his realm a tributary. But his name lingered, not for what he built, but for the day the mountain betrayed their promise, and the steppe learned the taste of Anatolia. And so the wind carried the last embers of that winter eastward. The mountain stood where it always had. Only the men had changed.